Welcome back to After a Pause. Here is something that will mess with your head. In 1543, Japan had never seen a European-style matchlock gun. The country had encountered primitive gunpowder weapons centuries earlier, crude metal tubes that came over from China around the time of the Mongol invasions. But a proper firearm, a weapon that a single soldier could aim, fire, and reload, that was entirely new. Within about 60 years, Japan may have possessed more matchlock guns than any single country in Europe, though historians still debate the exact numbers. And then, after building up this enormous arsenal, Japan essentially let it all sit. They froze their firearms technology in place for 250 years. Then, when they were finally forced to modernize, they did not dust off the old matchlocks. They built an entirely new military machine, largely from the ground up. And they used it to destroy a European fleet. 400 years, one country, the strangest relationship with firearms in human history. It starts on a small island. The year is 1543. Off the southern tip of Japan, there is an island called Tanegashima. Ta-ne-ga-shi-ma. Not a place where history is supposed to happen. A few thousand people, farmers, fishermen. The local lord is a young man named Tanegashima Tokitaka, about 15 or 16 years old. In feudal Japan, that is old enough to inherit a domain. But this is still a teenager, running a quiet island at the edge of the known world. One day, a Chinese trading junk drifts into the harbor. Chinese ships come through all the time, so this is nothing unusual. But on board this particular ship, according to traditional accounts, are 3 Portuguese travelers. The people on Tanegashima have never seen a European. They have no idea what Portugal is or where it sits on a map. These men have strange faces, strange clothes, and they cannot speak the local language. One popular account says they communicated by scratching Chinese characters in the sand, which is plausible, given that educated Japanese could read classical Chinese, though we cannot confirm this detail from contemporary sources. What we do know is that these men are carrying 2 objects that no one on the island has ever seen before. 2 matchlock arquebuses. According to a document called the Tepuki, the Chronicle of Firearms, compiled roughly 60 years after the event, the young lord Tokitaka watched a demonstration. One of the Portuguese aimed at a target. There was a crack like thunder, a cloud of smoke, and the target was destroyed. No arrow, no blade, just a metal tube and fire. We do not know exactly what went through Tokitaka's mind, but we know what he did next. He bought both guns. Later accounts claim the price was enormous, perhaps around 2,000 gold pieces. Whether that number is accurate or was inflated by later chroniclers, the point is the same. Tokitaka paid a remarkable sum for 2 objects nobody on his island understood. He clearly saw something worth paying for. He handed the guns to his best swordsmith, a man named Yaita Kinbi Kiyosada. Ya-I-Ta-Kin-Bei. His instructions were simple. Figure out how these work. Make me more. Kinbi was a master metalworker. He had spent his life forging swords, working with steel at temperatures and tolerances that few craftsmen anywhere could match. But a gun is a fundamentally different problem. A sword is about the edge. A gun is about containing an explosion inside a tube and directing it forward. Kinbi managed the barrel. Japanese metallurgy was already world-class, and shaping a hollow tube was within reach. The problem was the breech plug. The small piece at the back of the barrel that seals it shut so the blast goes out the front and not into the shooter's face. The Portuguese guns used a threaded screw to close this seal. And while Japan was not entirely unfamiliar with helical mechanisms, Japanese smiths had never cut the kind of fine metal threads needed for a firearm breech plug. Kinbi could see the spiral grooves. He could feel them with his fingertips. He understood what they did, but he had no idea how to cut them. Imagine this man, one of the finest metal workers on the island, sitting in his workshop, turning this small foreign object over and over in his hands. He can see the solution is right there, in the metal. He just cannot reach it. The Tepuki tells a famous story about what happened next, and I should be upfront with you. This is almost certainly a legend. According to the Chronicle, a Portuguese blacksmith aboard the ship knew the threading technique. Kinbi supposedly gave his daughter, a young woman named Wakasa, in marriage to this foreigner, in exchange for the knowledge. There are no Portuguese records that confirm any of this. It reads like the kind of dramatic detail a writer adds decades later to make a good story better. But legend or not, what is certain is that within a few years, Kinbi and the smiths around him solved the problem. They figured out how to cut threads into metal. And once they did, the floodgates opened. Think about what happened next. Tanegashima is a small island, but Japan is a nation of metal workers. For generations, the craft of sword making had produced an extraordinary concentration of skill in shaping, tempering, and finishing steel. Cities like Sakai, near modern Osaka, and Kunitomo, in what is now Shiga Prefecture, were already home to hundreds of experienced smiths. When the gun designs reached the mainland, these men did not start from zero. They had the hands, the tools, and the metallurgical intuition. They just needed the blueprint. And now they had it. The spread was not overnight, but it was remarkably fast by the standards of the era. By the 1560s, roughly 2 decades after the first matchlocks arrived, firearms were reshaping major battles across the country. What had been a curiosity on a remote island had become a standard military technology. And the timing could not have been more explosive. Japan in the 1540s was deep in the Sengoku period. Sengoku, the age of warring states. It had been raging for over 130 years. Dozens of regional warlords called daimyo, were locked in constant war. Alliances made and broken, castles besieged and burned, entire provinces changing hands. Into this came the gun. And the gun changed the math of war. Training a skilled archer took years of daily practice. Mastering the sword took a lifetime. A samurai was an investment of decades. But a peasant conscript could learn the basics of loading and firing a matchlock far more quickly. The weapon itself was far from perfect. It was heavy, slow to reload, useless in the rain,
and the firing sequence had over a dozen steps. Armies did not throw away their bows the moment guns arrived. Archers and gunners fought side by side for decades. But the core equation had shifted. A man with much less training could now pose a lethal threat to a warrior who had trained since childhood. That fact rippled across every battlefield in Japan. The warlord who grasped this most clearly was Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobunaga. He was brilliant, ruthless, and deeply practical. He had been acquiring firearms since the late 1540s, just a few years after guns first touched Japanese soil. By 1575, he had assembled one of the largest concentrations of firepower in the country, and he was about to use it. The Battle of Nagashino. Nagashino. June 1575. Nobunaga and his ally Tokugawa Ieyasu faced the Takeda cavalry, one of the most feared mounted forces in Japan. The Takeda horsemen were legendary. Their charge had broken armies before.
Nobunaga chose his ground carefully. He positioned roughly 3,000 arquebusiers, according to conventional estimates, behind rows of wooden palisades, sharpened stakes driven into the earth. When the Takeda cavalry thundered forward, they hit the stakes. And then the gunfire hit them. Volley after volley poured into the charging horsemen at close range. Horses screamed and fell. Riders were thrown and cut down. It was not elegant. It was not a perfectly choreographed rotation of firing lines. You may have heard the famous story of Nobunaga's 3 rotating ranks, one firing while 2 reload. It is a dramatic image, but most modern historians consider it a myth that appeared centuries later. What actually happened was probably cruder, but no less effective. A massive concentration of guns behind solid fortifications, firing as fast as each man could reload. The sheer volume of lead was enough. After Nagashino, the message was clear to every warlord in Japan. The old way of war was dying. By the time Japan was unified around 1600, historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of matchlocks were in circulation across the country, with a population of roughly 12 to 15 million. Some scholars, following Noel Perrin, have argued that Japan may have had more firearms than any single European nation at the time. Other historians consider this claim speculative, given the thin quantitative evidence on both sides. What is not debated is that Japan had achieved an extraordinarily high density of firearms for the 16th century. And then, something very strange happened. Japan let it all go quiet. After the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, the Tokugawa clan won control of the country and established the shogunate. What the Tokugawa wanted above all was order. And they got it. For roughly 250 years, Japan experienced a level of internal peace that is almost unheard of in world history. Now, I need to clear up a popular misconception. The Tokugawa did not ban guns. You sometimes hear this claim, especially from Noel Perrin's 1979 book, Giving Up the Gun. Great title, compelling argument, but modern research, particularly a detailed study by historian Tamara Inomoto using domain-level registration records, paints a different picture. Firearms were never formally outlawed. Farmers kept matchlocks for hunting. Coastal villages held them for defense. Regional records from the Edo period show thousands of firearms registered in civilian hands across various domains. What the Tokugawa did was control production, impose strict registration, and limit who could manufacture new weapons. They also severely restricted the country's contact with the outside world, a policy called Sakoku. Sakoku.
Foreign trade and technology inflow were tightly constrained, channeled mainly through a small Dutch trading post in Nagasaki. There was a trickle of Western knowledge that came through, a field the Japanese called rangaku, Dutch learning. But it was a trickle, not a river. The result was not a country without guns. It was a country whose gun technology froze in place. While Europe progressed from matchlocks to flintlocks to percussion caps to rifled barrels, Japan's firearms stayed exactly where they had been in 1600. The matchlock sat in the cabinet. It still worked. Nobody improved it. Meanwhile, the samurai class built an entire culture around the sword. The katana became a symbol of honor, discipline, spiritual refinement. Carrying a sword meant you were somebody. A gun had no such poetry. Firearms were not absent. They were present, but culturally demoted and technologically frozen. 250 years passed. And then, on July 8, 1853, the world came knocking. 4 American warships appeared in Edo Bay. 2 of them, the Susquehanna and the Mississippi, were steam-powered frigates. The other 2 were sailing ships being towed behind them. The Japanese had never seen a steam-powered vessel. These ships moved without sails. They moved against the wind. They belched columns of black smoke into the sky. The Japanese called them kurofune. Kurofune. The black ships.
Commodore Matthew Perry stood aboard the Susquehanna. He carried a letter from the American President, Millard Fillmore, requesting that Japan open its ports to trade. Perry delivered the letter, made it clear he expected an answer, and then left. He told the Japanese he would return the following year to hear their reply.
Picture the scene from the Japanese side. For 250 years, the outside world had been kept at arm's length. Yes, the shogunate had received intelligence reports from the Dutch trading post in Nagasaki. As early as 1852, a Dutch agent had provided detailed warnings about Perry's planned expedition, including the composition of his fleet. They knew, in theory, that Western nations were expanding. But reading a report is one thing. Watching iron-hulled ships glide into your harbor under their own power, belching smoke, carrying cannons that outranged anything Japan possessed, that is something else entirely. Japanese artists made woodblock prints of the black ships. In some of them, the vessels look like sea monsters, dark shapes, trailing smoke across the water. Perry returned in 1854 with more ships. Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate. It was the first crack in 2.5 centuries of restricted contact. What followed was one of the most rapid political collapses in modern history. The shogunate, already weakened by internal divisions, could not agree on how to respond to the foreign threat. Within 15 years, it was gone. In 1868, a coalition of reformers, many from the powerful domains of Satsuma and Choshu, overthrew the Tokugawa government and restored authority to the emperor. This was the Meiji Restoration. Meiji means enlightened rule. The new leaders moved fast. In 1871, they launched one of the most ambitious diplomatic missions in history. The Iwakura mission, named after its leader, Iwakura Tomomi. Iwakura. Over 100 officials, scholars, and students left Japan to tour the United States and Europe for roughly a year and a half. Think about what this means. A country that had been largely closed to the world for over 2 centuries
suddenly sent a large delegation of its senior leadership abroad to study everything. Factories in Manchester, shipyards in Glasgow, military academies in Berlin, parliamentary chambers in Washington. They visited iron foundries and watched artillery drills. They toured railways and telegraph offices. One member of the mission, Kido Takayoshi, kept a detailed diary. He wrote about the overwhelming scale of Western industrial production. The blast furnaces, the rolling mills, the warships under construction. These were men who had grown up in a country of wooden castles and paper screens, and they were walking through the engine rooms of the Industrial Revolution. They came home, and they started rebuilding Japan. In 1873, Japan passed a national conscription law. All males at the age of 20 were required to register, and many, subject to lottery and exemptions, were conscripted into the military. This was a revolution within a revolution. For centuries, warfare had been the exclusive domain of the samurai class. Now, farmers, merchants, and laborers were being issued rifles and uniforms. Japan did not pull old matchlocks out of storage. It imported and then manufactured modern Western firearms. Factories went up. Arsenals were established. The army was initially organized along French lines, later restructured on the Prussian model after the Franco-Prussian War demonstrated the effectiveness of the German military system. Railways were built, telegraph lines were strung. Japan was not merely upgrading where it left off in 1600. It was building a modern military, largely from the ground up, though it drew on the existing expertise and institutional knowledge that 2.5 centuries of domain arsenals and samurai military culture had left behind. Not everyone accepted this.
Saigo Takamori. Saigo Takamori. He was one of the great heroes of the Meiji Restoration. He had fought to bring down the shogunate. But Saigo was a more complicated figure than the simple image of a reactionary clinging to the past. He was not blindly opposed to all modernization. What he opposed was the speed and the manner of the changes, the corruption he saw in the new government, and the way the samurai class, his class, was being systematically stripped of its identity. Their stipends were cut. Their right to wear swords in public was revoked. Everything that had defined them for centuries was being erased. In 1877, Saigo led a rebellion. His initial force was around 12,000 men, eventually growing to roughly 20,000 as more Satsuma samurai joined. They were skilled fighters, but they were facing something new. The imperial government mobilized tens of thousands of troops, with approximately 30,000 deployed against Saigo's forces at key engagements. These were not samurai. These were conscripted men from farms and workshops, trained in Western formations, equipped with modern rifles, Gatling guns, and artillery. The rebellion ground on for months, but the disparity in firepower told the story. By September, Saigo was trapped on a hill called Shiroyama, overlooking the city of Kagoshima. He had somewhere between 300 and 500 men left. The government surrounded the hill with overwhelming force, troops on the ground and warships offshore. They bombarded the position with an estimated 7,000 artillery shells. On the morning of September 24th, Saigo and his remaining men charged down the hill. He was hit by a bullet early in the fighting. The popular legend says he then committed seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai. But the historian Mark Ravina, drawing on contemporary accounts, has argued that Saigo was probably too badly wounded to perform the act himself.
A companion likely took his head after he fell, following the samurai custom of preventing the enemy from capturing it. The exact details remain uncertain. What is not uncertain is that Saigo died on that hill. And with him died the last armed resistance of the samurai class. The new Japan kept building. In 1894, Japan went to war with Qing Dynasty China and won a decisive victory. The world took notice. And then, in 1904, Japan went to war with Russia. The Russian Empire, a European great power with one of the largest armies on Earth. The climax came on May 27, 1905, the Battle of Tsushima. Tsushima. Russia had sent its Baltic fleet on one of the most grueling naval voyages in history. 18,000 nautical miles, 7 months at sea. Sailing from the Baltic, around Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to reach the Pacific. The ships were worn down, the crews were exhausted. They had been harassed and delayed at every stage. In the North Sea, near Dogger Bank, they had even accidentally fired on British fishing trawlers, sinking one, and nearly triggering a diplomatic crisis with England that required international arbitration.
They entered the Strait of Tsushima, expecting a battle. What they got was a disaster. Admiral Togo Heihachiro was waiting with the Japanese combined fleet. Japan had an advantage the Russians had not anticipated: wireless telegraphy. Japanese scout ships spotted the Russian fleet early and radioed its position, course, and speed. Togo knew exactly where they were and how to intercept them. The battle lasted 2 days. When the smoke cleared, Russia had lost 21 ships sunk, including 7 battleships. 7 more were captured. Around 5,000 Russian sailors were dead or drowned. Over 6,000 were taken prisoner. Of the 38 Russian vessels that entered the strait, only 3 made it to Vladivostok. Japanese losses were 3 torpedo boats sunk and 117 men killed. It was the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, 100 years before. And it was the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a European great power in a full-scale war at sea. The news sent shockwaves around the world. In colonized nations across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, people heard what Japan had done, and the same thought spread. If they can do it, why not us? And so, here is the full arc. In 1543, a teenage lord on a tiny island bought 2 matchlock guns from Portuguese travelers on a drifting ship. His blacksmith stared at a threaded screw and had no frame of reference for what he was looking at. Within a few years, Japanese smiths had cracked the problem and begun producing firearms at scale. Within decades, Japan's battlefields were transformed. By the turn of the 17th century, the country held one of the highest concentrations of firearms anywhere in the world. Then it locked that technology in place for 2.5 centuries, while the sword took center stage. When steam-powered warships forced the question open again, Japan did not simply resume where it had left off. It studied the West, rebuilt its institutions, and constructed a modern military that within a generation could stand against the great powers of Europe. The gun is the thread that runs through 4 centuries of Japanese history. But the real story was never about the gun itself. It was about a society that kept making choices: when to pick it up, when to set it aside, and when to come back with something the world had never seen before.